Welcome. Welcome. My name is Aurélien Portuez. I'm the director of the Schumpeter project on competition policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by three distinguished scholars who have published and thought a lot about the interaction between antitrust and innovation. Elise Dorsey is partner at Kirkland and Ellis. Ellis is a visiting scholar at the University of Virginia and an adjunct professor at Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. She previously served as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General in charge of Antitrust Division at the U.S. Department of Justice. Richard Gilbert is Professor Emeritus at UC Berkeley. Richard served previously as Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Economics within the U.S. Justice Department. And we're also very proud to have Richard as Advisory Board Member of the Schumpeter Project at TIF. Richard is also the author of a must-read book, Innovation Matters, Competition Policy for the High Technology Economy, published in 2020 by MIT Press. Well, talking about MIT, we also have with us Professor Richard Schmalensee. Professor Schmalensee is Emeritus Professor of Economics at IMT. Dick served as Dean of the MIT Sloan School of Management and was a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisor from 1989 through 1991. He published 11 books, and perhaps the most relevant for today's discussion being his latest books, Matchmakers, The New Economics of Multi-Sided Platforms, published in 2016 at Harvard Business Review Press. So today's discussion is about this Neo-Brandeisian revolution that is in antitrust, that is taking full speed. We have the complete Federal Trade Commission after the last commissioner was sworn in on May 16, 2022. We have a number of antitrust bills that are now reaching a momentum. And also even in the EU, we have the Digital Market Act that is about to be finally adopted. So the Neo-Brandeisian revolutions aim at reorganizing market structure to redistribute power and wealth in the digital age and for digital markets. There's a sort of return to a structuralist analysis, and the Neo-Brandeisian prioritize competition perhaps over innovation, a deconcentrated market, despite the inevitable network effect in the digital economy. So Neo-Brandeisians disparage disruptive innovation in digital market as a source and as a result of competition. For instance, in a 2019 article titled Separation of Platforms and Commerce, Lina Khan, now FTC chair, wrote that, quote, expectation that the tech sector will sufficiently be fast-moving and rapidly innovating are, quote, too rosy expectations. And therefore, this needs a more aggressive antitrust enforcement in the digital market. So, in other words, the Neo-Brandeisians don't really believe in the kind of Schumpeterian gales of creative destruction, this kind of endless disruptive process that challenge incumbents and that force companies to compete and innovate fiercely. This process does not materialize in the digital economy, according to Neo-Brandeisians. So the question today is whether that process and these kind of disruptions take place and whether we see it in the digital economy. So is disruptive competition absent in today's economy that is mostly digitalized? And what are the antitrust implications, whether the answer is positive or negative? So our panelists will discuss these notions and many others. So first, Rich, let's go back to perhaps the market structure matter. You wrote in 2006 an article titled "Looking for Mr. Schumpeter: Where are we in the competition innovation debate?" A title, of course, that I explicitly borrowed for this panel. So market deconcentration perhaps increase static competition, but is it best to foster innovation? And why is market concentration perhaps not necessarily the best metric to spur innovation? And what are the antitrust implications for this market structure focus? Rich?
Thank you, Aurelian, and good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whichever is relevant. So let me begin with a quote from our patron saint, Joseph Schumpeter. So he said, "Perfect competition is not only impossible, but inferior, and has no title to being set up as a model of ideal efficiency. Instead, he emphasized competition for the new commodity, the new technology, source of supply, the new type of organization, competition which strikes not at the margin of the profits and the outputs of existing firms, but at their foundations and their very lives." Um, he was right then, and he continues to be right today. Uh, but what Professor Schumpeter did not tell us is how do we design competition policy to promote the innovation that is so important for the economy. Now, competition policy has historically been price centric. The focus has been on how mergers or unilateral conduct might raise prices or maintain prices above competitive levels. Um, Now, antitrust enforcement and the consumer welfare standard that has been part of antitrust enforcement for some time is certainly broad enough to consider innovation concerns. There's nothing about antitrust policy that prevents that type of analysis. Uh, but there are very few cases that have turned on innovation effects. We don't get a lot of insight from these cases about how to treat these issues. And moreover, many of these cases have adopted presumptions or analytical approaches that aren't very helpful for innovation. So we don't have a lot of time, so I will limit my remarks to merger policy. Now, some say that mergers suppress innovation incentives, sort of the same way that they increase prices. Others say that mergers increase innovation incentives by increasing appropriability, which allows firms to capture more value from their R&D expense. Still others say that the conventional approach to market definition, which is often for good or bad determinative of merger outcomes, is fundamentally flawed because it doesn't uh, take account of innovation capabilities, or for that matter, the potential for creative destruction. Now, there is some truth in all of these views, but to sort of parse out these different arguments, I think it helps to distinguish uh, market definition and, more importantly, market power in product markets and in research and development. Now, competition in R&D typically promotes innovation. It's a good thing. Uh, that competition necessitates a expectation of a positive payoff in the product market after the innovation is successful. And that's facilitated by patent rights or first mover advantages or whatever. But the successful innovator has to make some profits. Now, most merger evaluation, and for that matter, if you look at empirical studies of mergers and innovation, um, they focus on the product markets, not so much on the R&D activities. And this can confuse the analysis of innovation effects for a number of reasons. Now, one reason is that the universe of relevant innovators can be much larger than the existing firms in the product market, or the universe could be smaller. There might be some firms that aren't likely innovators. There's another reason, which has to do with the replacement effect that was identified by Kenneth Arrow 5 decades ago. Now, the replacement effect tells us that market power in a product market can suppress innovation incentives for innovations that cannibalize those profits. In a paper that I wrote with Doug Melamad, we call that coincident innovation. Now, for coincident innovation, mergers, or for that matter, other conduct that raises profits or increases market power in the product market can actually discourage innovation incentives, and it should be taken into account. Uh, But at the same time, a merger analysis also has to consider the potential for increased appropriation, either from complementarities or new facilitating internalizing knowledge spillovers, for example. And there is also an issue about whether the market definition should be more broad or narrower to identify potential innovators. Now, some say that the potential for disruptive innovation means that we should be less concerned about adverse effects from a merger. I think we should be careful about this conclusion for two reasons. First of all, disruptive innovation, if it occurs, it might not occur for a long time. And that doesn't justify accepting higher prices from a merger or anti-competitive conduct in the interim before that disruptive innovation occurs. Now, a second reason is that potential disruption should make us more concerned about some types of mergers. Consider, for example, Facebook, back then, Meta now, Facebook's acquisition of Instagram. If that merger were actually analyzed and went to court under conventional price-centric analysis, it would not probably be challenged because Facebook and Instagram were operating in different markets. But Instagram did have the potential to be a disruptive innovator for Facebook and the market for social networks. And a innovation-centric analysis might actually have challenged that merger. So innovation-centric merger analysis and also for unilateral effects can be very different than a price-centric analysis. It can be more tolerant of some mergers, for example, and less tolerant of others. So with apologies for being a two-handed economist, that is my conclusion. I will end there. It depends.
That's a very interesting way to kick off the discussion. And yeah, the less focus, that's the whole point of your book, the less focus on price and product and more focus of antitrust enforcement in the dynamics and the innovation effect of different business behaviors and mostly mergers. So this also perhaps brings the question of market structure to a lesser role, and that we'll come back to that in a minute. Dick, you wrote a lot about the effect of multi-sidedness of platforms and the way these platforms are precisely intermediaries. So one side of the market, one side of the platforms often subsidize the other side of the platforms. For example, if I search online, I search for free because advertisers funds Google's operating cost of running a search engine. This is very similar to old business models, actually, such as, for example, waiting at a bus stop that towns don't pay because advertisers finance the bus stop. And so that's a very interesting way of the different platforms work, but it's not necessarily very new. Two-sided platforms over the last few years are now very well known in antitrust enforcement, and yet they're very much under major antitrust scrutiny. So, Dick, should we assess the two sides of a platforms as one relevant market? This is perhaps what has been suggested in the famous American Express case. Or should we treat these different markets and should we treat the different sides of the platforms as separate markets? And what are the overall antitrust implications of the antitrust analysis applied to two-sided platforms?
Apologies for being slow to unmute. That's a great set of questions. It doesn't admit to a simple answer. Let me talk about the American Express case. I filed with a colleague an amicus brief, and we simply said that, look, they're in the business of transactions. They're in the business of facilitating transactions between merchants and consumers and making money off those transactions. No transactions, no income. They measure market share against the other systems by transaction volume. Why would it ever make sense to separate that and say, no, they're not in that business. They're in two related businesses, a consumer business and a merchant business, and we should just look at the merchant side separately. In the case of a transaction platform, it's always seemed to me to make the most sense to focus on a single market for transactions. Surprisingly, the reaction to that conclusion in the Amex decision has been, I would say, almost hysterical in the US, in the antitrust community. In Europe, I mean, they discussed this years ago and say, there are different kinds of platforms. Not every platform can be described as American Express could be as a transaction platform. And also, it depends on the charge. The Times-Picayune case, which involved newspapers, is an interesting example, right? I mean, that's not newspapers aren't transaction platforms. They don't make money only when I look at an ad. They sell newspapers and they sell advertising. Traditionally, maybe still today, newspapers are sold to subscribers below marginal cost. And there was a charge, but you wouldn't say there's only one market here. There really are two businesses. They are linked. You got to analyze the linkages. One of the charges in that case was predatory pricing. I think it was that advertising in one of the two papers involved was being sold below cost. The court said, no, wait a minute. We have to look at the whole business. We can't just look at one side of it. This is in 1952, maybe 57. Said, no. A predatory pricing charge has to do with the business as a whole. Other charges, in the case of newspapers, wouldn't make any sense to look at for the business as a whole. The question of, did it have market power in advertising? Good question. Court said no. There are many other ways that advertisers reach consumers. You didn't have to look at the whole business to assess the question of, did they have market power in advertising? So my point is that a little confused here. Platforms have been around for a long time, multi-sided platforms. They are different from ordinary businesses in some respects. It is not uncommon for one side of the platform to be priced, transactions involving users on one side of the platform to be priced at or below marginal cost. That is not, that doesn't demonstrate predation. You got to look at the whole business for that. In some cases, in some kinds of platforms, it makes sense to do the sides separately, but there's no doctrinal purity here. I mean, these are economic questions. Platforms are economic actors. There is a relevant theory. There is a fair amount of experience, and I think Amex, whether you think it was correctly decided in terms of the ultimate outcome, I think the market definition adopted was correct. I happen to think that a contract that says, if you agree to accept my card, you mustn't hassle consumers when they try to use it, is not an unreasonable restraint of trade. But others may differ. But I think it's absolutely right that in that case, for that platform, treating it as a transaction platform, treating the market as a market for transactions was just absolutely the right thing. And many Europeans who've dealt with these issues would have just nodded and said, yes, of course. The American reaction in distinguished circles has been surprisingly hostile to that market definition. And maybe we can come back to it. But having thought about it, and frankly, having worked in payment cards, it just seemed an obvious conclusion in that case for that charge.
So that's a very, very interesting insight. And as you just concluded, in that case, which means also we need to have a case-by-case analysis, because platforms are very different from one to another, like transaction platforms as opposed to intermediary platforms for services like Uber or Airbnb. So we'll come back to that. I'm sure it will trigger some nice discussions with other panelists. Perhaps let me move on to Elise, because I want to reflect on these Neo-Brandeisian revolutions that we see unfolding. It seems like Neo-Brandeisian, and I think they argue explicitly about it, they want to maximize competition, and competition understood as markets populated with small firms over maximizing innovation, if it means that innovation will lead to larger, perhaps, firms sometimes. And so sometimes antitrust can get it wrong, in the sense that sometimes antitrust enforcement can hurt innovation by undermining the very competition that antitrust is intended to preserve. So do you have is there any legal precedence where antitrust laws and enforcement kind of deterred innovations, or just helped less efficient rivals and protected less efficient rivals? Do you have any cases or examples that where just we will help understand that antitrust sometimes just err?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, which is very thought-provoking, and also just for having me here today. So I think, as Richard mentioned early on in the discussion, perfect competition isn't necessarily the viable in the first place. Like, it's not something that materializes in the real world, and it's also not necessarily the most desirable in every market. I think, this discussion so far today, as is already alluded to, and, with Dick's closing remarks, you really need a case-by-case basis, because you can't just say that, markets with more competitors are going to be more competitive and better for consumers. There are many different reasons why different markets end up looking different, right? Because of the different factors at play, and the different way, consumers are served in markets. Sometimes there are efficiencies or economies of scale. Sometimes that's less obvious. So I think, to as a starting principle, right, it's a difficult proposition to start from. We just need to maximize the number of competitors in a market. I think that's not, under the consumer welfare standard, doing the work that you want it to do in terms of actually realizing consumer benefits and making consumers better off. And I think that we did see, a lot of that early on in antitrust case law here in the US, where a lot of the court decisions were, in essence, protecting less efficient competitors. So you saw that, for instance, in cases like Utah Pie, where, the court pretty clearly held that, the lower prices that the defendant was charging were anti-competitive, because all these other competitors who couldn't meet those prices, had to charge higher prices, were not able to compete. And that, was really, I think, to your point, undermining the very essence of competition and what you want. It's driving price competition. And so the court's decision there, I think, really did directly protect some less efficient competitors who, couldn't offer consumers the lower prices that the defendant could. It's something you saw a lot, again, towards the middle of last century, and kind of led to this norm within antitrust of, the in-hospitality tradition, which I think in a couple ways gets to your point. One is, in the obvious, some of these court decisions explicitly, protected less competitive companies. But I think in addition to that, right, what you saw was effects on innovation, and not necessarily in the way we typically focus today, right? So in, terms of what is, innovation on the product level, but innovation in terms of, the firm structure and setup, and how firms are organizing themselves and organizing with others, right? So you saw during the in-hospitality tradition, a lot of the times what would happen is, if courts were unfamiliar with, a business model or, a particular type of joint venture, they'd condemn it pretty quickly. And that, really cut down on the kind of innovation you could see within firms that really, kneecapped what they were able to do lawfully, without risk of a lot of, antitrust and its commensurate potential treble damages. So there was, I think that's another really important facet of the discussion, right, is not just in terms of, what we are seeing enter the marketplace in innovation, but also, internally how firms are organizing and operating. And so I think there's a lot more to say, but I will for now stop there and look forward to our panel discussion.
Great. That's true that the UTAPI example is a very good example of how sometimes antitrust preserve from said cutthroat competition. This competition that is too fierce, and rivals perhaps sometimes ask antitrust to be insulated from this kind of very fierce competition. So to all panelists, I think we can now engage in panel discussions, and going back to the main theme of disruption. First, does anyone wants to react to anybody's remarks and what you've heard so far? I'm sure you.
Well, I have a comment. I have a comment about two-sided markets and market definition. I testified on behalf of Amex in the case, the Amex case, and I think both sides of that case recognized this was a two-sided market, and that you had to take account of both the merchant side and the issuer side to get the right answer. But that is different from defining a two-sided market. And the problem I had with that, and I don't think I advocated that in my testimony. Maybe Dick, you would have been a better witness in that case than I. The problem with that is the same type of problem we see in innovation effects, actually, which is that market definition is complicated. And two-sided market definition is really complicated. And it is often used really as an excuse to throw out a case. The market definition is too complicated, or the market definition, becomes then the focus of the debate rather than the competitive effects. I mean, I've actually read legal decisions that said we recognize that there are competitive effects as a result of the conduct or the transaction at issue, but I'm going to rule in favor of the defendant because the market definition was incorrect. Now that just strikes me as crazy.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that. One comment on Elisa's remarks. Thank heaven it's been a long time since Utah Pi. I love to teach that case to undergraduates and say, does this make any sense to you? Why does this not make sense to you? And Rich, market definition is hard, and two-sided platforms are hard. But as I remember reading the district court opinion in the Amex case, both sides said it's a platform, and both sides came close to saying, experts on both sides, it's a two-sided transaction platform. And the judge said, well, that maybe means I should define the market as transactions, but that's a step too far. Well, was it or wasn't it? I agree with you that you shouldn't toss out a case because market definition is difficult if you have strong evidence of competitive effects. I think the competitive effects evidence in Amex was sort of silly, but that's just me.
Just to react on what you just said, should we not toss out the very process of market definition itself because it's just too complex and too complicated? It seems like antitrust is moving toward that direction. If you look at, for example, in the EU Digital Market Act, there's no kind of market definition. In the antitrust bills, there's no market definition. There's no search for dominant power anymore.
Well, let me give you my favorite example in a piece I wrote a long time ago that involved, it was a predatory pricing case involving Real Lemon, which made concentrated lemon juice. And if the market was concentrated lemon juice, Real Lemon was essentially a monopoly. And if the market was lemon juice, Real Lemon was a small player. And of course, there were cross elasticities and this and that and this and that. And you would hate to have that case tossed simply because, oh, gee, we can't get a clean market definition here. The question was, what are the competitive effects? And also this related to innovation. What are the competitive effects of the complained of action by Real Lemon? It was a predatory pricing case. But that's my favorite example of why you can't lean too hard on market definition, because in some cases, it's just too soft and squishy. Is there market power? Are there anti-competitive effects? Is the competitive process harmed? That's somewhat more reliable.
So I wouldn't say market definition is unimportant, but we don't want to elevate it to be, the decisive, determinant issue in a case. And it should be addressed. And the Digital Markets Act is a good example of, I think, the problem of ignoring market definition. It shouldn't be ignored entirely. You have an act that's premised on the idea that you have a handful of firms that are gatekeepers, who presumably are something like essential facilities, which to me says they have enormous market power. And yet we're going to analyze it without even thinking about market power. I mean, the whole issue with all these bills in Congress and the Digital Market Act strikes me as odd, to say the least, because what they're saying is we don't have the antitrust tools to identify problems, but these are markets where if there are problems, they should be pretty obvious, because these are markets that have lots of reasons to have market power. So why should it be that hard to identify the market power? Why should we adopt an approach that says we're not even going to think about market power?
Let me just add, I think market power is the more fundamental concept. And you read courts elevating market share above that and saying, well, the only way we can assess market power is by share of a well-defined market. Well, that's not the only way you can assess market power. And you shouldn't get hung up, like in the Real Lemon case, where you just can't get a satisfactory definition. Okay, let's look at other indicia of market power. Let's look at the effects on competition. Let's look at the effects on, in fact, an innovative entrant in that case.
That's a key takeaway. That's a very good point. Like the notion of market power rather than perhaps the exercise of market definition is the key element. Elise, do you want to read like this notion of antitrust law? Like, of course, market power is key, but it has not always been key, or at least it's just losing some ground.
Yeah, and I think this discussion highlights a really important point that you really don't want to let the market definition exercise distract from what are the competitive effects in the market. That's really what we care about at the end of the day, right? And whether you can get the perfectly defined market really should be kind of secondary. Again, it's helpful to the extent it's a proxy for what's happening in the market and what we think competitive effects are. But I think definitely you don't want to be distracted, and especially because within antitrust law, once you have settled on a market definition, that has several other follow-on implications, like Rich was saying, where you might not be able to consider certain effects, right, if the market isn't well defined, or on the other side, right, in terms of efficiency, right, if you're defining the market overly narrowly, perhaps and especially when it comes to two-sided platforms, right, if you're cordoning off what's happening on one side of the market, for the court, right, the market definition then doesn't allow them to consider what's happening on the other side. So I think that was, legally an important reason why the Amex case came out the way it did, was in order to actually assess the full set of competitive effects, you had to define the market in a certain way.
Yeah, and I think that's, if that's the teaching of Amex, it's too broad. In the case, say, a newspaper, where it's not a transaction market and there's no single definition like eyeballs on ads, no. But to analyze newspapers, you have to consider both sides. If you read some of the OECD discussion of platforms, it is, you either consider these two closely linked markets that you can't just ignore one of them because they're so closely linked, or it's a single market. But you can't ever say, well, we'll just look at one side because, hey, that's the definition.
Yeah,
that just distorts the economic reality in platforms.
And we see increasingly cross subsidizations, like one side of the market doesn't pay and the other pays. So that's also that helps cross-subsidizations, like entering new adjacent market and disrupting new market when one side of the market help leveraging, but also leveraging can be an antitrust liability. What's your thought on that, Rich? Like this aspect of leveraging and disruptions and different adjacent markets. We need disruptions. We need entry into different market, and you quoted Schumpeter, like free entry is no entry at all. But at the same time, this entry by also some large players may be seen as anti-competitive in the current antitrust aggressive mood.
I think, Aurelian, that gets at this issue of whether there is self-preferencing or discrimination or maybe predatory innovation, because there are certainly circumstances in which platforms can easily move into neighboring markets. They have economies of scale, economies of scope, the infrastructure to do that. And do we treat that as a competitive problem or maybe a competitive benefit? To me, I think that the existence of economies of scale and economies of scope and complementarities is probably a good thing. Now, if it's used in a way to raise entry barriers or innovation barriers for what are sometimes called edge innovators, the new innovators, then that's a bad thing. And we should distinguish that types of conduct. I've always had problems with the European Commission in the Google shopping case, and I was a consultant to the FTC on that case, and we came out very differently. I think we came out the right way, but now the European Commission approach seems like it's going to be solidified in the Digital Markets Act. And we have a bill in Congress that's making some progress that would do the same for the US. So go figure,
I think
how it happens.
I think it's important to recognize that while all platforms do benefit from cross-platform externalities, and some benefit from having data, the strength of that effect varies enormously. In our book Matchmakers, we use OpenTable as our example of a two-sided platform. And OpenTable benefits from network effects of all kinds, and OpenTable has a lot of data, and OpenTable now faces active competition from a number of players. So whatever those effects are, you can just look in the marketplace and you say, well, they haven't taken over the world. Google in search, however, seems awfully secure. Uber and Lyft both benefit from economies of various kinds, and yet that seems to be active competition.
Look at Facebook and TikTok.
Yeah,
TikTok's a problem for Facebook, and the network effect argument goes both ways, which is it can be a very important factor to sustain monopoly power, but once it gets rolling for a competitor with single homing for consumers, so they choose which side to go on, it can accelerate the decline of the incumbent.
Yeah. Well, looking for Mr. Schumpeter, as this panel is titled, how can we incentivize disruptions like these very aggressive and dynamic competitions that we all want as consumers? Because that's the way incumbents are challenged and the process of competition is fostered. How can we help this process of disruptions? Is it with how the Neo-Brandeisians may say, like with the market populated by small firms that are small and nascent competitors that can compete? Or do we have somehow to accept that the disruptors can also be small firms, but also large firms, and that size may not be the right, may not, at the end of the day, may not be the right way of looking at competition effect. What's your take on that? All of you, do you think that the Neo-Brandeisian agenda will help disruptions or will prevent disruptions at the end of the day, in terms of the focus on firm size?
I think that's just a misplaced focus, right? I mean, if you've spent time in Washington, you've dealt with the agriculture lobby. And that has to do, trade associations composed of small players have a lot of power. And look at where political contributions come from. They don't come from large corporations. They come from hedge funds. Why do we have the carried interest exemption? Because of hedge funds, not because of General Motors or AT&T or anybody like that. And if you're Amazon, you may say to yourself, given the number of guns pointed at my head, how come my size doesn't translate into some kind of useful political power? So I think that the sort of central hypothesis that bigness per se poses a threat to democracy is overblown, way overblown, given the ability of industries to organize, which we see all the time. So I'm disturbed by the provisions that have absolute firm size as a high absolute firm size as the threshold. Concentration we can talk about, but firm size I think is just misguided.
Right. Elise, what about firm size as a criterion for antitrust?
Yeah.
Does it help disruptions at the end of the day?
Yeah, I don't. I'm with Dick. I think I don't, know that it necessarily does, or again that it makes it better. And I think that also that worldview kind of takes a very myopic view of competition and what competition has to look like in a given market. And I think what we know from, several decades of, a lot of economic work here and, over 100 years enforcing the Sherman Act is, that competition is generally pretty messy. It's not necessarily linear, especially when it comes to innovation. I think there's, a lot of experimentation and some trial and error. And I think, if we're overly focused on making competition look a certain way and follow a certain procedure, that's going to have negative effects in terms of allowing some of these disruptive moments to arise.
Right. Rich, that's a very complex questions of disruption and competition, because per definition disruptions is not known, because otherwise you will face the innovator's dilemma, right? So how can regulators, antitrust enforcers help predict or kind of conceptualize disruptions? You see what I mean? Like the probability of a firm being disruptors or being disrupted. How can you square that in?
So I may have to respond quickly because I have a poor internet connection, so I'm cut off in any case. You can that might be a good thing. Look, we're not really in the business like so many strategic management people of telling you how to innovate, but we are in the business of competition policy to promote that type of innovation. I think we need better merger policy. I don't think our merger policy is as good as it can be. I think we need to be tough on conduct that prevents other people from innovating. But the notion that you can't merge if you're worth more than $5 billion strikes me as rather silly.
Right. Okay. Dick, any reaction on the notion of disruptions? And
well, we all seem to be in violent agreement here. So I wish I could say something controversial, but look, it's the business of antitrust policy to enable innovation and to enable competition and to try to remove unreasonable restraints. So there are limits to innovation that come from the public sector, from a whole set of rules and regulations. Think about the difficulty that the building industry had getting plastic pipe in to replace pipe that took lots of plumbers. That was a disruptive innovation, and boy were there obstacles to it, and boy did they come from local governments. So the business of antitrust is to remove remove obstacles posed by established firms to disruptors. what it can do to encourage disruption, I don't see anything. I think disruption happens where it happens. Think about the COVID vaccines, right? I mean, I work in Cambridge. Moderna is a Cambridge firm. Moderna is a tiny little firm, tiny, that used a disruptive technology to produce a dramatic innovation. Now, that's what you want to see.
Mm.
And a lot of people who had shares in Moderna got quite rich. That's a good thing. And Moderna is now in a position to do other things. That's what you want to see. Had there been obstacles to bringing that vaccine to market, obstacles posed by, say, traditional large pharmaceuticals, that would have been the business of antitrust to deal with.
Right.
But there weren't.
And therefore, protection of intellectual property rights and patents is a way to scale up and preserve innovations.
Well, I think Rich made this point very nicely at the outset of our discussion, that on the one hand, you want competition in the product market, but you need intellectual property rights to encourage competition in innovation. And sometimes the enforcement of those property rights will lead to concentration of one kind or another in the product market. Those rights should be limited, both in duration and scope, but you have to have them.
Right. So just to come back on the firm size and this idea of regulating firms by size rather than the very important notions that we just referred of market power and potential abuse of market power. The antitrust bills that are currently discussed regulate firms by size. So if you have to explain, each of you, if you have to explain to someone to how these antitrust bills may impact and have an effect on innovation and may perhaps stifle innovation, how would you explain that? Perhaps, Rich, I know you had a panel on antitrust bills. How can we explain that these bills may have an effect on innovation that is not necessarily positive?
Well, there are a lot of bills that say a lot of things.
Yeah.
And there are some provisions in some of the bills that actually make sense. Things like merger retrospectives and other things like that. So I wouldn't, categorically say that all of them or every element of them is unproductive. But it is unsettling when, in the rare instances when Republicans and Democrats agree, and often here for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
They each have problems with a set of companies, and they're different problems. And most of their problems are not actually antitrust problems. Right. And we're using antitrust laws to address non-antitrust issues. I think it is essential. I think we would agree it's essential that competition policy be designed and implemented in a way to maximize the ability to innovate. But crafting bills that basically ex ante say that certain things can happen or certain entities cannot do certain things is very possibly excluding certain types of beneficial innovations, and that concerns me.
Let me make a specific example, not involving particular firms, but a standard way that biotech companies operate is they're drilling wells, they're trying to find new compounds, they're trying to find new technologies. And if they find them, they do not have the ability to commercialize them. They don't have a distribution network. They don't have any way really to make money. The way they make money is they are purchased by large pharmaceuticals, which then take the products effectively to market through their field forces and so forth. Now, if you say those large pharmaceutical companies can't merge, then you have just shut off that pathway of innovation. Just absolutely. Now, that's just dumb. That's just, and it happens in other areas as well, where small disruptors come up with clever technologies that they can't exploit, and large firms exploit them. Now, sometimes the argument is, that merger was to suppress that technology, not to exploit it effectively. And that becomes that becomes a conundrum. But to say that large firms can never do that
Right.
is just, to coin a phrase, nuts.
Yeah, that's the difference between per se rules and rule of reason. Elise, what's your take on the antitrust bills?
Yeah, I was going to say also, just to, build off of the point Dick was making, I think that the pharmaceutical space is a really good example, because there's also a lot of impediments, right? There's a lot of regulation here that's really hard for these startup companies who don't have experience there, again, to practically get their products to market. And this is a space where, if you have a more established company that has done this, multiple times and knows how to navigate that regulatory field, it can really help expedite, so it's just, we were talking a little bit earlier as well about the different impediments to competition, how not all of them are, some of them are government and regulatory, not all of them are, from within the market itself.
Yeah, that makes me think about the distinction between invention and innovations. These small firms may invent, but they have no way of commercializing their invention, and innovation will take place with, as Dick said, like with large distributional networks, and that these small startups don't have.
And innovation comes in many flavors, right? I'm constantly reminded by colleagues that while we all want everybody to be driving electric vehicles, the performance attributes of internal combustion engines and the associated vehicles have improved dramatically in the last 30 or 40 years. That was not by and large, disruptive innovation by small firms. There's an example. It was relentless pursuit of incremental innovation by large people competing with each other. That's an essential part of the process. Now, the Klobuchar bill has a line in it that says, an exclusionary action is any action that disadvantages an actual or potential competitor. You read that and you go, wait, what? So GM goes to fuel injection, which makes it hard for anybody else, for Ford to compete. That's an exclusionary act. And there's some language that says they might be able to get away with it, but maybe not. I mean, So innovation comes in flavors.
That's you don't want powerful rivals to use antitrust to protect themselves from the forces of competition. That's what you refer, and that's very important, and that's not perhaps what we have in those bills. To conclude, I mean, that was very fascinating discussions, and we have to conclude. Perhaps one word for each to conclude. Rich, you wrote years ago, I think in 2006, in this article, that we still have to learn a lot about competition and innovation debate, and I think he must have gone. So the question is, what have we learned about the last 20 years about the relationship between competition and innovation, precisely in the digital market and in all these high-tech industries? Is it competition leading to innovation, or innovation leading to competition? What's the relationship, and how can do we have a clear theory or clear approach, or is it still very confusing as it was many years ago?
I think we've learned that the world is more complicated than we might have thought. When people first looked at network industries, think about the Betamax versus VHS struggle. And, there was a winner, and the winner took all. And so we began to think that where there are network effects, and then you look at Microsoft Windows in personal computers, and you began to say, oh, you get a lead. You take over everything, and that's a real problem for antitrust, because it becomes critical to make sure that early competition is on the merits. Any little bit of exclusion, and the excluder will rule the world. Well, we've now seen plenty of examples where there are network effects, but there is competition. Take job search websites. There are a lot of them. Monster.com is big, but there are a lot of specialized sites. Take dating sites. There are a lot of specialized sites, even though there are network effects. Uber and Lyft compete. So we've learned that the world is more complicated, that the winner doesn't always take all, and that there can be successive rounds of competition. Oh, it's harder than we thought. I think we've learned that in the digital space. One likes to find simple rules. Of course, economists like complicated markets that we have to get paid to analyze, but but even we would like there to be simple presumptions of one kind or another.
Mm,
You shouldn't fix prices is a pretty good presumption. You shouldn't fix wages is also a pretty good presumption. We don't go deeply beyond that in the network space.
interesting. Those bright rules are very hard to define and to
Yeah.
identify. Elise?
Yeah. Well, so I appreciate that, you're ending on a very simply answered question. But yeah, no, I think again, Dick raises a lot of, very good points, where it's just we don't have necessarily a clear roadmap to exactly how innovation manifests every time in every market, right? It looks very different in different places. And there's, like we were discussing, very important incremental benefits and innovations. And then there are also really big disruptive ones. And we're trying to, encourage both of those different kinds of innovations over time, right? And I think that requires you to be cognizant of different metrics, and really, again, to Dave's point, focusing on potential impediments to competition within the market, and making sure that firms aren't taking actions that are preventing incremental or bigger innovations, and doing what we can, again, to kind of protect that, because it's tough when it's a really difficult thing and happens in so many different, and again, unpredictable ways, right? That's why it's disruptive, is no one predicted exactly that this could happen.
Right. That's a very interesting, and the legal implications, if I understand well, is that we need to keep having a case by case approach, and where the role of the courts and ex post rules and ex post enforcement play a major role, rather than perhaps ex ante bright rules, bright and clear prohibitions. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just say, because Elise made this point about regulation. I mean, think about Uber. Uber's a disruptive entry against taxis. How have taxis responded? They have responded in the courts, in city councils, and have, as the taxi industry, run afoul of the antitrust law? Not to my knowledge, but they've done all they could to discourage that innovation through other means. Did they violate the antitrust law by doing that? Well, there's the Pennington issue, and the Neo-Brandeisians suggest that should be revisited.
Right.
But let me just say, I mean, the pendulum swings, right? I mean, Elise talked about Utah Pie, and there are a number of other cases in that vintage that I love to teach to undergraduates, like, explain to me how this makes sense. And then the pendulum kind of swung to the Chicago view that all markets self-correct, life is good. That was too strong, clearly too strong. And the pendulum is now swinging in the other direction, maybe too far. But the notion that there are ways we can toughen up enforcement that will increase economic efficiency, I think, has broad support. And I think there are very few people who say, well, we've got it exactly right now. That's good. And particularly that the judiciary has it exactly right now. So I think there will be reforms. I just hope they're not crazy. We shall see.
Yeah, just as a final word, would you both agree that these kind of disruptions that we see, the digital age, is the kind of a new Gilded Age of the that was in the late 19th century, and with disruptions and with very strong innovations, we inevitably see some sort of populism and an increase of this kind of antitrust populism. So is it not inevitable in this pendulum swift that when firms are disrupting and upsetting some market structure and local ways of life, isn't not inevitable that we will politically see some responses that will fuel populism? I kind of I kind of
That's hard. There is one view that expressed by at least one historian that the Sherman Act was in part a reaction against the disruption of local markets produced by the fact that railroads enabled distant competitors to enter, and that there was a populist component to the Sherman Act. I am not a historian, and I can't assess that really, and I can't assess what's inevitable. I can't answer the question that you ask, but it's an interesting question.
Elise?
Yeah, very.
You wrote about
that. Yeah, very interesting question. I think always very interesting also to speculate in terms of, what might or might actually happen in the government. When it comes to congressional legislation, I'm always very skeptical until anything gets passed, that anything will actually get passed. So we'll see.
Yeah. Great. So thank you so much for these panel discussions. Rich had to leave us a bit earlier, but it was a very interesting conversations and very thought-provoking comments and remarks. I thank you so much, and you all take care. Thank you.
Great pleasure.